So, good evening, everyone. It's me, Paul Woodadge, here for World War II TV. Another evening show, another interview, another great guest. We have with us, beaming in from England, Claire Mully, to talk about her book, The Women Who Flew for Hitler. Good evening, Claire.
Hello.
So, where to start? I mean, it's an exceptional book. I've got it here. Read it last year. Had a little quick read through before the show. It is about two women, and I'll let Claire talk in a second, who are test pilots. They are aviation pioneers, attractive, charismatic German women with the Third Reich. But in another way, they couldn't be more different, could they? So, Claire, tell us a little bit about who these two women are and their careers.
Okay, big question. So yes, I was amazed when I first found out that there were any women who flew for the Third Reich, it being such a sort of macho, the fields of flight, especially in Germany. But actually there were quite a few women that acted towards the end of the war, 1944 onwards, as ferry pilots, a bit like the women who were part of the ATA over here. But these two stand out. They were the only two women who served as test pilots. And one of them was also an absolutely amazing engineer. And so I suppose they had a little bit in common. They were both brilliant pilots, otherwise the Nazis wouldn't have let them anywhere near their machines. They both had a strong sense of courage and duty and patriotism. And they both learnt to fly at the same time. They learnt to glide when, in the very glamorous era of flight in the 1930s, when Amelia Earhart had her own fashion line and On Avion was the perfume of choice. They were part of that set. And they also both flew in the 1936 Olympics in different roles. So they kind of had this parallel thing going on. And then in 1939, the war really highlighted their differences. And what really fascinated with me with their story is that they made very different choices, and they made decisions and they took the actions that ultimately put them on opposite sides of history.
So, and the 20s and 30s is a period where science is being shared internationally. There's a big fascination with kind of technology, and aviation is an exciting new thing. And they're part of this movement as well, which is an international thing. So they're known outside of Germany. And then, as you say, 1939 is a game changer, and everything starts becoming a little bit more nationalistic. So. Yes. Let's start with which one do you want to start with first? Should we start with Melitta or should we start with Hanna? Let's get a little bit of a background about. Let's start with Hanna. It's my show. I've made the call. Let's start with Hanna.
Well, I hesitate to say it. Maybe we should start with Melitta.
Okay, let's start with Melitta. Fine. Well,
she's about 8 years older, whatever, than Hanna is, and so she remembered the First World War from when she was a girl. In fact, her uncle was a pilot in the First World War. He was friends with Ernst Udet, and so she came from this really patriotic aviation family, and so that's her in the stripy top there. And she, I think at the end of the war, was, particularly hit by the ruling on aviation in Germany, which was that motorized flight was banned. And in fact, the Air Force was destroyed. And I mean, literally, the planes were sawn into pieces and their fuselage was chopped up. And I think gliding was the sort of phoenix that rose from all of that destruction, because it gave the new German youth an opportunity to compete internationally and try and restore some glory for their country. And of course, flight is associated with all these wonderful things like freedom and power and modernity, all things that the Nazis wanted to associate their regime with. And so they adopted it and put some money in and so on. It became this very big thing. And in fact, Melitta took her first flight in 1920. When she was helping all the young men who were sort of in their +4s and their knitted jerseys, and they were going out gliding, and she was just watching, but she would help drag these very fragile canvas and bamboo or wood gliders back up the slopes. And to thank her, after some days of this, they let her have a go. And I think they thought that she was just going to sort of slip down on the grass, but she'd been watching very carefully. And she pulled on the stick at the right moment, and they went down. They were sort of pulled down the slope by these rows of young men pulling a rubber tow cord. And at the right moment, she pulled on the stick, lifted the nose, and then let go of this cord that spiraled away, and up she went into the air. And she always talked about the fabulous feeling of freedom it gave her. She talks about the borderless sea of the air. It's all about freedom for Melitta. Hanna's very different. So I should have mentioned that when Melitta, 1920, when she's taking her first flight, actually Adolf Hitler is taking his first flight as well, though that was very different. That was in the open cockpit of a biplane off to what he hoped to take part in the Cat Putsch in Munich. But of course, that was unsuccessful. He had to make a rather embarrassing exit from the airport. Anyhow, Hanna, much younger, comes from a very different background. She's sort of grown up with the Third Reich, whereas Melitta is older and she remembers the older sort of Junker values. Here's Hanna in a much more advanced glider. This is much later on. But I think she actually took her first flight when she was age 7, but that was when she climbed up to her parents' bedroom and opened, they had these sort of French windows, and she stood out on the balcony and just threw herself off into space. Luckily didn't break any of her legs. Well, either of her legs.
Either, yeah.
And anyhow, but she was always, as a child, fascinated by flight, and eventually badgered her parents into letting her. They didn't really want to, they were quite traditional, but she took gliding lessons, and she was just a naturally brilliant glider pilot. So she ends up flying all sorts of things, though, as she went through the war. So Melitta, both of them volunteered for service when war came, but because they're women, they were never actually in the Luftwaffe. They were seconded civilians. So there weren't any women in the Luftwaffe. I think they thought that they would ruin their lovely parades in uniform. Their profiles just didn't fit, did it? But both of them very quickly were in service.
And they must have been exceptionally good and gifted. I mean, you just said that yourself. To rise in an environment that is very, male and macho and testosterone, and they must have been very, very good to rise. So that how are they both recognized as being good, and how did they get to the point where they're allowed to test stuff? Because it's an incredible story, and
they had very different routes in. I mean, Hanna was, as I said, she was a brilliant glider pilot, and that's really where her real skills lay. But she also flew all sorts of other things. And so in 1938, she became the first woman in the world to fly a sort of prototype helicopter, an autogyro. And actually, she flew it at the Berlin Motor Show, which was another opportunity, a bit like the Olympics had been 2 years earlier, for Hitler to sort of impress the international community with the revival of Germany under his regime, as he would have had it. And so one of his sort of the top billing part of the show was for a helicopter to be flown inside a building, which is the great Deutschlandhalle built for the Olympics. And Hanna was the pilot of that. It was extraordinary. There's footage of it. You can go to the Imperial War Museum. It's probably on YouTube now and see it. It's absolutely remarkable. And there is Hanna flying a helicopter. But she went on through the war. I mean, she flew this amazingly huge glider called the Gigant, or Giant, which was, I think it could take 200 fully armed men, or even a tank. They go sort of in a glider, and then it would open up at the front, a bit like a seed pod, and this tank could come juddering out. But it was massive, and she's only about 5'4" or something like that. So she had to put a cushion on the seat to be able to reach the controls, and she tied wooden blocks onto the bottom of her shoes to be able to control it. I mean, it's insane that they sent her out like that, but it just shows how much they valued her skills, that they would put her in that position. And she, of course, later on in the war, she flew the Comet, the Messerschmitt 163, which is one of the first rocket-powered planes. She said it was like riding on a cannonball. Wow. Although actually, I don't think she ever flew it under power. I think she just liked to tell the good story. Because her skill was gliding, they took it out for test flights under the wing of a mother plane and let it go. And then because it's fired by these very highly combustible two fuels, which is very dangerous because the whole thing's likely to explode, and they're very corrosive. They corroded through the seat and through a few of the test pilots. Nevertheless, she was desperate to have a go. But the fuel would burn out very quickly, and she would have to glide it down to test the gliding landing. Although she said it glided very badly, like a grand piano, she said. And of course, at the end of the war, she also tested a V1, basically, well, it's a prototype cruise missile. Yeah. So absolutely extraordinary. So I think she's the only woman and one of the very few people in history who's flown a manned version of that. So absolutely brilliant. Melitta, very different. She was absolutely brilliant intellectually. She was an aeronautical engineer. I think she was the only female engineer to study for aeronautical engineering at the Technical University of Munich. And she was absolutely brilliant. The Nazis needed her. They would never have allowed her on the airfields otherwise. So she actually, among other things, she developed the dive sights and the dive brakes for the Stuka dive bomber. So this is the machine that's really synonymous with the Blitzkrieg, you know, the Junker 87, and the 88 is the bigger bomber that she worked on as well. And so she was the only engineer. They didn't really want it at first because she was so skilled. They wanted her skills at the drafting table, but she'd spend all day doing that, and then she'd go out and she'd insist on doing her own test flights. So you fly high, and then you come down at about 80 degrees. It's near vertical, at about 350 miles an hour towards the Earth. And then at the last minute, she would lift the nose and hopefully skim back around the fields and not crash into the Earth. But it was incredibly dangerous. You know, you could often lose consciousness. The test pilots did lose consciousness. She did. She admitted sometimes, but she managed to regain that in time to make her landing. And if one male test pilot tested one of these, you know, did a dive test one morning and they made some alterations, and he went back in and tested it again in the afternoon to see the difference, he wasn't just considered courageous, he was considered really heroic. But Melitta would go in and she'd do 15 nose test dives in a single day. She did over 2,000 during the course of the war. Nobody came near her. Absolutely extraordinary. And the reason why she was risking life and limb was because she needed to show the Nazi regime that she was irreplaceable. She was uniquely valuable, the only person who could do this, because she had Jewish heritage. And the Nazis defined her in their horrendous terminology as Mischling, or half-blooded, basically, or mixed-blooded. And so she was trying to not only save her own life, she applied for equal to Aryan status on the basis of her skills, but also save the life of all of her family. She refused to accept that status when it was offered to her, unless it was given to all her siblings and her family. So she was really working under duress to try and save her family. But that wasn't enough for her in the end. So,
I mean, this is where it gets interesting, because their careers kind of start at the same time, and in the book they kind of converge and part and separate and come back again, and they're kind of rivals, but they're also part of the same kind of organization, and they didn't like each other. We'll elaborate on that in a minute, but that, to me, that their interesting reasons for doing it are what makes it so fascinating, because they kind of represent the two sides of the regime. And you know, when you're researching it, because in my research for the show, in terms of Hanna, there's quite a lot of books out there already. She wrote her own book, and she lived, you know, 30
That's
years.
not exactly accurate, though. But yeah.
No, well, as a lot of war memoirs written by the people themselves are generally perhaps not the most accurate. With Melitta, there's only kind of, as far from my research, there's only one book, and it was in German only, and of course she died, you know, at the end of the war. So when you're researching these ladies, is it easier when there is a body of work in advance, or is it better to start with a blank canvas? I mean, is there a particular preference? Do you like to start from absolute scratch?
Well, I don't mind. I'll take whatever I can find. I'll take it. I'm just a very nosy person. I love asking questions. I love getting there. But the research was, you know, absolutely fascinating. I was really lucky because I managed to interview a couple of people, service people, who had worked alongside them or remembered them, and that was on both sides of the war. So I interviewed for Hanna. I interviewed a chap called Jack Pragnell, who was absolutely wonderful. He was a veteran who'd been in Bomber Command, and the connection, the reason I was interviewing with him was he served in Operation Hydra, which was the bombing of Peenemünde. And Peenemünde was on the Baltic coast. It was the proving ground for the Nazi regime, where they were testing the V2s and the Comet and so on. Sorry, the V1s and the Comet. Yeah. And Hanna was there on the night of the bombing raid. And in her book that you mentioned, her memoir, she said, "Oh, I slept through it. It was nothing." She gives it like half a page. Of course, it was a massive, there were 800 planes in the air at one time, at one point, you know, largely American as well. And so I wanted to ask Jack, you know, could she have possibly slept through it? What was the raid like? Because he took part in it. And it was absolutely fascinating talking to him and getting those really immediate insights. And then I met him again about 2 years later, and the book had come out, so I had given him a copy. And the start of an event, someone gave a talk, and I went up at the end and I said, "Oh, you know, just wanted to say goodbye and thank you." And he said, "Oh, it's a marvelous book, well done." I said, "Oh, thank you very much, but you've only had an hour, you know, you can't possibly have read it." And he said, "No, I've not read it. I'm not going to. No, I looked me up in the index and I read the bit about me, and that's excellent." It was just so fantastic. But yeah, I interviewed him, and I got to interview a number of times Eric Winkle-Brown. I don't know if he's
a legend.
Yeah, total legend. And I got to know him quite well. Went down to his house, met his wife, and he was brilliant. He would phone me up in between and say, I've got something else for you. He had this lovely Scottish accent. So he was really generous. So I think I met him about 4 times. And the last time I met him, he shook my hand and said goodbye. And he'd never been formal before. And I just thought, oh my gosh, he's getting on. And, so I thought I was quite touched by that. And then he said, you should be careful doing that, because you're just 2 handshakes away from Hitler, because he knew Hanna before the war, during the war, and afterwards, and he'd shaken her hands many times, and she'd of course shaken Hitler's hand. So I mean, that gave me pause for thought. You sometimes talk about shaking hands across history, and I thought, well, I've really done that,
Wow.
And then on the Melitta side, you want some stories? Or
yeah, sure, yeah, that's it's all brilliant stuff.
Well, so researching Melitta was very different, because she hadn't written her memoirs and so on. In fact, she'd been pretty much written out of history, and that was partly because of Hanna, who I think was envious. She wanted to be the only female test pilot for the Nazi regime, and so I found, among the things I found was a cache of letters that she'd written to Melitta's sister many years later, when Melitta's sister Clara was going to write a biography, and she's basically threatening her and warning her off, and talking about Melitta's embarrassing racial burden, as she put it, horrendous. She was horribly anti-Semitic. So that was a really interesting find. But anyhow, so I didn't have that to start with. So I got in touch with Melitta's family, and they were absolutely fantastic. They kind of interviewed me for a while, and then they went for a chat in the kitchen while they put the kettle on. And then they came back and said, yeah, okay, we're going to open our archive. And they had all sorts of things, portraits and family trees and letters, and they had Melitta's handwritten diary, which maybe we'll talk a bit about later. They had one of her cousins gave me this, which is sort of, it's reproduction, it's not the original, but this is the chocolate given to the Nazi pilots. It's called Choca Cola, because it's chocolate, caffeine and cola, to stimulate them and keep them going. But it was full of pervitin really as well. I don't think this stuff is, but yeah, so it was, they were keeping them going. Apparently Melitta used to give this to her niece, and who was a little girl, because the kids didn't have sweets, a bit like over here, so she would save up her pilot's chocolate and give it to her, and then her niece would be bouncing off the walls for about 4 days. But and the other thing I found when I interviewed the families, later I managed to get in touch with Melitta's in-laws as well, because she married Count Alexander, and I managed to get in touch with her nephew, because Melitta and Alexander didn't have children, but their eldest nephew is called Berthold, Count Berthold. And I phoned him up. Well, we swapped a few emails, and then I speaking on the phone, and he said, well, if you want to interview me properly, you'll have to come over, but you'll have to come tomorrow, because then I'm going away. I think it's the only time I've put the phone down and pretty much gone to the airport. So I went over, and he was absolutely fantastic. I spent the day with him, and he had all of these stories. He remembered his aunt very well, but he's always saying, everyone's always asking me about my father, but no one asked me about my aunt. So it was very fresh, not these sort of retold anecdotes. So that was fantastic. And then at the end, he clicked his heels in this kind of quite a Prussian way, and he shook my hand. And I just thought, oh gosh. And then he said, you should be careful who you shake hands with. And I just thought, oh,
here we go
again. But yeah, because his father had shaken hands with Hitler. But of course, his father, not everyone that shook Hitler's hand did so with great enthusiasm, because his father was Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, who of course was the main mover behind the Valkyrie bomb plot, the 20th of July bomb plot. And Melitta was involved in the middle of the plot. I think this is perhaps one of the episodes of the Second World War that is most written about, is the bomb plot. It turns up everywhere, but I'd never seen a reference to Melitta in this. So I really wanted to check out that his story was right and everything. And when we found her diary, I had her handwritten 1944 diary in my hands. It was amazing. And I turned to 20th of July 44. I've got to say, it was all in German and sort of coded as well. But the family helped me, and we and a German academic as well, who'd done some work on her, and we kind of worked it out, and this incredible story unfolded. So not only did we have 2 female test pilots for Nazi Germany during the Second World War, one of them, Hanna, was a fanatical Nazi, very anti-Semitic, and the other one, Melitta, was actually secretly part Jewish, and secretly involved in the resistance. So Melitta was involved in the most famous attempt on Hitler's life, and Hanna actually personally tried to save Hitler's life in a different point in the war. I just couldn't believe it. And I think then I knew I'd got the book I had to write. Yeah.
Well, that's the hook, isn't it? And that's what, when I reread it or read it the first time, looking through it again, is the potential rabbit holes you could disappear down, because they met so many people. And the whole von Stauffenberg thing, as you said, is a series of books in its own right. And every name that comes up, you kind of feel that could go off down an entirely different tangent, but you're going to kind of keep it focused on it's these two women and only the kind of what directly concerns them. But it must have been almost frustrating doing that research work because otherwise the book would have ended up being 1,000 pages of all the side stories. I mean, because they go all the way through the Nazi regime. They are there through every major stage of it, as you say, on kind of both sides of it. Extraordinary. And the von Stauffenberg link is incredible. So, I mean, we talked before going on live about, your biographer. You've done great books on different subjects, about whether or not you, when you're researching, need to have any kind of empathy or sympathy for these people you write about. Do you need to feel a connection with them? Do you remain detached from it? Because you've got Hanna, who is, a fervent Nazi, and Melitta, who's not. I'm thinking that you kind of felt more of an affinity with Melitta than you did with Hanna, but would that tarnish writing the book? Do you have to kind of remain objective?
Well, before we went live, you actually said, do you have to like?
Yeah, I said like. Yeah, it was a bad choice of word. Yeah.
Which is going a bit further. I don't think you have to like people that you write about. I mean, otherwise we'd have no books on Hitler, Stalin, whoever.
Yeah, true.
I do think you have to think it's important, it's worth telling their story. But I actually think it's really important that you go in with your mind open as far as possible. Now, before I started looking, at the start of my research into this book, I did read which was then quite new, I think it was the latest biography of Hanna. And it sort of said, Hanna, she's been classified as a Nazi, but really she was just serving the Third Reich. She didn't have much choice, although actually she did have choice as a woman. She didn't have to be doing this at all. In fact, she had to fight to get those roles. But it said, had she been working for Britain, she'd be a real heroine, and we should just recognise her courage, skill, and her beauty. Her beauty is neither here nor there, I think. Eye of the beholder anyhow. Her courage, absolutely. She had an incredible, she at one point, she had a crash, and she wiped the nose off her face. She had to undergo very early pioneering plastic surgery, and then she got back her strength, she got back her sense of balance, and she went back into the test program in incredible courage, but she had no moral courage at all. And she was a fanatical Nazi. Now, there's no point in starting your research thinking, I'm going to find everything to tick that box and make her as evil as possible. I thought it'd be more interesting to start with, there was a baby born who ended up taking on these values. Here she is doing the salute, wearing her Iron Cross, and that's a lovely little, I'd say lovely, it's a diamond sort of pilots and observers badge. It's the only one made, it was made for her, a sort of feminized version of it, anyhow, it's unique. Yes, I thought it would be better to let her reveal. There's no hiding what she was, and I don't want to. I wanted her to show herself. So there's no point in trying to, some people, when I finished this book, they said to me, it's really interesting, you've written a book about good Nazis. And I was like, no, I have not. Nazis, there are no good Nazis. And someone else said, oh, you've written a book, I love that, you've written a book about bad women. And again, no, these sort of terms, they don't do anything to help us understand. This is a book about two real women, two human beings who made very different choices. And like you said, their motivations, what moved them to take those choices, the position they were in. Obviously they were acting under the very perverting conditions of war and dictatorship, and the lack of information they had and so on. But nonetheless, in fact, they probably had more information than many inside Germany. And they're both on this scale, if you like. They're somewhere between complicit and really quite culpable. But I think this, it's really easy to try and just make everything black and white. And what really interests me in history is the grey area and the nuances. And I think if there's only one thing that's black and white in this book, it's the appallingness of the regime and the real hypocrisy of the Nazi regime that said, there's only one place for women, or, Kirche, Kucke, Kinder. They're not meant to be doing this kind of stuff at all. And there's no place for Jewish people in the Third Reich, obviously none. And yet, when they needed the skills of people, they gave their highest awards, the Iron Cross. Both these women got the Iron Cross. They're both nominated for first class. They both received the second class, and Hanna got the first class. Melitta didn't get the first class because the assassination attempt happened in the middle. But, they were given their highest awards, even though they were both women in the very masculine field of flight. And one of them, the regime defined as Jewish. So I think it's
that's where it gets complicated, because you can I've heard historians say before that the Nazi regime, compared to other regimes at the time, in some ways was fairer in terms of medals. They didn't look at class in terms of medals like perhaps the British did. We kind of tended to perhaps favor the upper class people, but that is in no way saying the Nazi regime is good. Identifying one tiny thing out of it that is less than awful. It's like Hitler was a vegetarian, wasn't it? That doesn't mean that he's in any way, it gets him off the hook, because he loved his dog. He loved his dog. Therefore, as you say, it's nuanced. And that's why I liked about your book is that you start off admiring. As I read it, I admire their pioneering spirit. I admire how they're battling their way forward in a male-dominated world and how they're pushing aviation. But I can have that thought in my head and also hate what Hanna was part of. It doesn't. I can have both those thoughts in my head at the same time. That's perfectly okay.
That's what I would like for the reader. I mean, personally, I never say I admire these women. I say, these are these women, please, And what I liked at first, I think, is that Hanna she's this very bubbly character. She's full of stories and anecdotes and fun. She's a bit naughty, and so she's very vivacious, and it's really quite easy to see good qualities within that as a woman at these times who wouldn't take it sitting down. Or, that, for example, there's a little story that was this recorded interview with a veteran. He remembered Hanna, and he said that she'd sewn her sort of pseudo uniform skirt suit that she'd made, but then she would put a white Angora sort of fluffy jumper on top, and he could never really work out why she would go to the trouble of making uniform and then putting a girly jumper on top. And it turned out that she'd mentioned to someone else that it stops the men in the Luftwaffe from putting their arms around her the whole time because they got fluff on their uniforms. So it was a sort of defensive thing. So when you hear stories like that, you really identify with her as a woman having to sort of fight those, gender battles at the same time as everything else she's doing. So I wanted people to be able to identify with both of them. Melitta is much more reserved, and obviously there's good reasons for that, but she's harder to identify with early on. But as you read the book and the women make their choices, and then they take, their very dramatic actions for very different ends, it challenges your concepts about that and makes you think about them again. And I think it's quite clear who the worst person is here, but it's good that they reveal that themselves through their own choices and actions.
And I'm just checking what's happening on YouTube, and we got a question from a viewer called Craig saying, how did you get on the trail of these two? And we're going to elaborate on that, because with all the fact they were well-known test pilots, you've got obviously all the German signal magazines, the propaganda side of it, which is perhaps complete bullshit about what they're actually doing. So how do you get through all the kind of, and Hannah's own autobiography, which is full of, exaggerations and change. How do you find the real people through that? In people that have been written about, particularly Hannah's case, written about extensively, you've got to try and find that real person there. So what process did you go through to try and, to get to that heart?
So there's two questions here.
Yeah.
First, how did I get to the story? I had written a book about the first woman to serve Britain as a special agent in the war, who was a Polish-born woman, actually, and became the longest serving agent for Britain, male or female, in the Second World War. It's absolutely fantastic. But I thought it would be very interesting to talk about some of the women in the air. And I knew a woman called Mary Ellis, who flew with the ATA. She was called Spitfire Mary, sadly no longer with us either. But I was with her, and I said, there are books on the ATA, but no one's ever written a biography of you. And she said, well, Claire, I'd love you to do it, but I've just finished writing my memoir. I was like, oh, damn it. But she said, why don't you look at some of the other women? So I was looking at Constance Babington Smith and people like that who worked in aerial intelligence. She identified the first V1s and V2s at Peenemünde, which how we knew what Peenemünde was. And that got me onto the Peenemünde story and led me to Hanna. And of course, Hanna is quite well known. There's a couple of different books on her, and her own memoirs, which are translated into English now. Are slightly different in French and German and English, which is quite interesting. So you can kind of read between the lines a bit there. And then I came across the story of Melitta, and I just couldn't believe it. That I mean, Hanna, there were all these papers. A lot of her papers were left to the Munich National Archive of Germany in Munich. Although I've got to say they were probably edited, having ploughed through them, and they took out quite a lot. But there's still quite a few very telling letters and documents in there, which were really interesting. So that gave quite a good picture of her. And then when I started researching Melitta, I discovered that Hanna had tried to hide her story. So there was this huge cache of letters that Hanna had written to Melitta's sister, which were really revealing, which of course she never thought would see the light of day. And so they were absolutely fascinating and very clear as to her character. And then I found that there's a chap, Ian Sayer, who has a collection of various different war memorabilia. And he had some unpublished letters that Hanna had written after the war to a friend in London. And again, she obviously thought these would never be seen publicly. And they talk about Jewish conspiracies, all sorts of things that have never been published before. And that really underlined that she was a lifelong Nazi. It wasn't just till the end of the war. You know, she had many opportunities to distance herself from Hitler and the regime and just say that, you know, she was working as a patriot for her country, a bigger Germany than the Third Reich, but she never did that. And these letters really enforce, in her own words, and that she was this fanatical Nazi. So that's how I kind of got her. Melitta was harder, of course, but having her diary, and I think one of the things with her is that after the war, you know, I mean, over time, a lot of these papers have been collected. So there's an awful lot in the military archives in Germany and so on, but not very much of her papers there. And I think because they were sort of women's papers, there'd been, well, nothing happened there, obviously. They were sort of filed under domestic and they were sent back to her family. And so they had this very rich cachet of papers that very few people had looked at. So to see her own writing in her own words, and you know, she recorded some of her dreams in there, all sorts of things. It was, and you know, one of the secrets, one of the things that got away was sort of folded up towards the back of that diary. She'd made 2 pages into a kind of envelope, and I opened it up, and there was a curl of hair in there. And obviously, I can't do DNA testing on it or whatever, but it's, you know, fascinating. She didn't write down whose it was, but there's a few contenders. So yeah. Going sort of below the radar, writing to everyone, reading all of that previously unpublished stuff. That's what helped me define who they were.
And you know, Hanna to me comes across as sort of not opportunist isn't quite the right word, but she kind of is always knows how to come out of things the best for herself, rather selfish. You know, post-war, she kind of just says enough to kind of carry on doing some flying and things like that, but doesn't denounce the Nazis, but doesn't. She's just seems to be cunning, almost like a politician's way of saying things without really saying, you know, those way they apologize without actually apologizing. She seems very devious. And just for those who have no idea what we're talking about, I mean, she lived, was it 1972 she died? I forget now. Was it?
A bit later. Well, carry on with your question.
But she did. She carried on flying, and she was received internationally. She travelled. She was still regarded as an aviation pioneer. I don't know, but so she was quite crafty. I mean, Melitta, of course, didn't survive the war to have any post-war career. But which year was it? Hanna died. Was it
78?
Okay, so she saw a lot, but you know, you absolutely do get to understand who these 2 women are as best as anybody can, reading it through a book about people who, you know, died decades ago. But, you know, one of the things that's why is it important to tell their stories? That you know, that people might say, why you're just writing about Nazis? How can that be any good? Shouldn't we let that just drop now? What's important about telling these women's story?
Well, I think there's so much that's important in it. I think it's really important. You know, I hope that what the book achieves, you know, both the good and the bad within it, is it shows how, to an extent, how Hitler was able to corral the forces of his nation, including the human resources, towards his appalling ends. And, if we don't try to understand this, then we can't just learn from things that go right. Yeah, it's the things that go wrong that we learn from. So how to understand, how to prevent this in future? What are the lessons that we can draw? We need to understand it. So how did Hitler manage to get them on side? How was he manipulating his country? But also, I hope it shows. I think it's important to look at the choices that were available to some inside the Third Reich. And of course, there weren't choices for everyone. If you're Jewish in Nazi Germany, there's very few choices. Any choices, certainly less and less, and then none. But for some, there were choices. So what were those? What was their ability to act in a different way? I said that Hanna had a lot of courage, but she didn't have any moral courage. Yeah. She chose to look away. I found documentation that she, during the war, found out what was going on at an extermination camp. And I think she chose to disbelieve it. She didn't believe it, but she really should have done, because there were, photostats of Himmler's orders with his signature on. There were photographs and all sorts. And she chose to look the other way. It was absolute denial. So we need to understand denial. Why? Why was she doing that? These are important lessons. I'd also think it's important from a gender point of view. We need to recognize that there were women with agency inside Nazi Germany, and there were female, obviously, supporters of the Third Reich with different amounts of knowledge and understanding. And these two women are very good examples of people who are odd, make different choices, have different levels of knowledge, come from different backgrounds, and show the sort of breadth of what could or could not be achieved inside that country during the war. So I think this is all really important stuff. Plus, I have to say, it's just this most incredible story with women in the air being shot at and doing dive bombing and flying cruise missiles. It's just absolutely incredible stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's a great story, and I think to understand why people made these choices, and Melitta being Jewish, I have, when there's the German cemeteries in Normandy, there's six of
Jewish,
half part Jewish. In Normandy, there are 7 German cemeteries, and they all have Jewish graves within them, and sometimes they are Jews who were deliberately concealing their actual race and hiding in the German army. Others, because they were trying to survive. They were just doing what they were trying to be part of something, so it didn't kill them. And it's hard to look at that and understand, because there's choice and there's choice, isn't there? There's choice and there's Hobson's choice, isn't it? It's survival. When does survival become choice, and when does choice become survival? And I think Hanna clearly makes absolute decisions to further herself and to be powerful and to enjoy the freedom of flying, compared to Melitta, he's often being forced into making decisions, because it's that, and the fact she's trying to keep her family alive as well gives a whole lot of extra level to it as well. So it's even that wasn't enough for her. So we have her deciding by 44 that it's not enough to just enable her family to survive and to survive herself. She actually has to take direct action against the regime. So yes, she has a changing perspective anyhow. And perhaps you could share a little bit of that story with us without giving anything away too much from the book. What the choice she makes, she does in 44 consciously decide she's had enough. So if you could run through a little bit of that without giving too much away.
Yeah, I don't really want to tell the whole story, I suppose.
No, but just a hint, drop a hint at,
I think most people know what perhaps not, the bomb plot was in July of 44.
Yeah.
But Hanna Melitta was involved. It was reading her diaries, and we found that in the months before she was meeting her brother-in-law, Klaus von Stauffenberg, her husband Alexander is serving in Greece at this time, so he's sort of not on the scene. But her 2 brother-in-laws, Klaus and Berthold, are looking for a safe space to meet, to conspire. And one of the things that she does is she provides a safe space for them, which is, because she's a pilot, she gets various perks. And one of them is she's allowed to take a yacht out on the Wannsee, the lake at Berlin. And if you're on a lake, if you're on a boat on a lake, you're much less likely to be overheard than anywhere else. So she's taking them out quite often on her yacht so that they can, the names of the people she's meeting are all the top conspirators. And then increasingly she's going to the Klaus's Tristanstrasse flat. And again, this is in the weeks before, and then she's there overnight 2 days before the bomb plot. This is not just for a cup of tea. She's clearly in the thick of the discussions, helping to enable it to happen. And because she has access to planes, later I read an interview with a man who said that she had told him that she had volunteered to fly Klaus to the Walter Lair to put the bomb down. She couldn't get the right aircraft on the day, and so they went with Luftwaffe air adjutant. But so you can see she's right at the heart of the plot. And of course, she's one of the people rounded up. They rounded up about 2,000 people afterwards, and she's one of them. And I thought that was it for her. But actually, she managed to talk her way out of trouble, and that's far from the end of her story. But enough. I mean,
we'll leave it there. Yeah, but I mean,
there are many more stories.
And that's what's so fascinating about it, is the choices they make. And I'm repeating myself slightly, but the giving a voice to females within the Third Reich, I think, is so important, because, you know, when you watch any of the classic war films, there's no women involved at all. If they are, they're passive, they're in the scenes, they're just providing tea and coffee, and to understand that they are just as much a part of it in all the ways is very important, because, you know, that a regime like Hitler's wouldn't have taken hold if it hadn't got support universally. And, you know, just because we see the footage in the 1930s, all the men with their arms up, you know, the women were equally looking for something different, wrongly, with Hitler. So anything that gets across the fact there were influential women, I think, is very important. So in terms of the research for the book and things, you did have access to these diaries and the people who've met these people. Do you have to kind of pinch yourself occasionally to realize you're so close, as you said, the shaking hands story, to such movers and shakers? It's quite humbling to realize that people's stories are passing through your hands that were actually changing the world. I mean, it's a lot of responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is a huge responsibility, and I don't think there is or should ever be the definitive history of the Second World War, or the definitive biography of any person, because we're always finding new information. Like you said previously, there hasn't been so much focus on the contributions, whichever side, of women. When I was researching my book on the female special agent, I found that when women spies are discussed, or women in the resistance more broadly, it tends to be told, even today, in these very sort of tragic and romantic terms. And of course, there was a lot of tragedy, and we need to honour the courage and the sacrifice. But I think we've been much less good at remembering how effective women were and the achievements that they delivered. And Christina Skarbek, that I wrote my book about, or Christine Granville, was one of the most effective women agents as well. So that's a story that hasn't really been told. And the same when you turn to Nazi Germany, we hear a lot about Eva Braun, but we've never, who's heard of Melitta von Stauffenberg? And yet she's right at the heart of things. So I think it's really important to tell these stories, and I'm going to try and keep doing it.
And women are always mentioned by their looks, aren't they? I mean, I did an interview with Sarah Megan Thomas, who was the producer and starred in A Call to Spy about Virginia Hall. And reading those, as you must have done, all those SOE reports, it's always about the women, about this pretty little mousy little thing. And it's so frustrating reading it when they're being judged by everything except their ability. And the same with, in my research for this, you're reading the old articles about Hanna. It's all about this pretty demure little, and you just, I don't care what she looks like. How is that in any way relevant to her ability behind the stick of an aircraft? It's so frustrating at times.
Was quite relevant though, because she was blonde and blue-eyed, and that did take her
True.
quite
in that sense it is relevant, but you don't get books about the men in that way. So anyway, with this year being an awful one, COVID-19, and festivals can't happen, and research work and archives and things, what next for Claire Mully? What's going to get teeth into next? Is there another World War II or something different, or haven't you decided yet?
Well, I'm juggling. I've got 6 ideas that I've written up a little bit. I know. I don't know if anyone's going to want any of them. But yeah, most of them are Second World War. One of them isn't. And they're on different sides of the conflict. And I think they're all absolutely extraordinary stories. But I haven't actually done a proper full proposal on any of them yet. So I should get on with that. I've been doing a bit of TV. I think I've got a bit more of that coming up, and a few things like this. Lots of articles and reviews, of course. So bits and bobs.
Okay, well, I'm just checking YouTube. Someone is saying we haven't talked much about their actual flying aspect of it. So perhaps is there a flying? I mean, we talked earlier about her their involvement in the Stuka, and of course the V1, which was a flying bomb. Any other particular? I mean, aviation relevance with, I mean, they were always there testing things, but particular story from one of them that we could just end on?
Oh my goodness. I don't know which story to tell. I mean, I did mention that she was testing the comet and was in a appalling collision. So she went up, the story of that is she went up, the comet was under the wing of the mother plane and she was taken up and she was meant to release it. How it worked is as the plane went forward, the comet was on a detachable dolly on wheels so it could roll along the ground. And when she went up, she was meant to detach that dolly and release herself and glide back down. And she'd already tested it a couple of times actually, which had been successful, but they're obviously making modifications. So she went up again, and on, I think it was her third or fourth test, she could feel immediately the dolly hadn't correctly released and various people were signaling to her. So she knew something was wrong, but she could feel the weight of the machine wasn't right. So she decided to try and, I mean, she's got no fuel. She's gliding it back down. There's only one place to go, and that's down. So she just tried to sweep in as low as possible. And in fact, Ernst Udet was watching on the airfield, just happened to be watching the testing that day. So he witnessed all this, as was, well, various other witnesses. And as she came down to land, she came down as low as possible and came along the runway. But the plane did, on landing, it was quite a hard landing, and it spun round and she was actually knocked unconscious. When she came round, she realised that she wasn't hanging in her harness, so she knew she was the right way up, it hadn't flipped. But she did what they were trained to do, which was check for any injuries. So she started with her legs and worked her way up her body, checking, and she thought she got away with it almost completely, until she later wrote, until her hand reached her face and the place where her nose had been, which was now just an open wound. And yet she realised, she thought she might have known what the problems were, so she got a pencil, and she had pencil and paper with her always, and she wrote down what she thought had gone wrong in the test. And then she took a white handkerchief out of her pocket and laid it over her face before falling unconscious, so that she wouldn't distress the rescuers when they came to get her, and that the findings would be kept if she died. I mean, it takes something to do that.
Yeah, and like I said, you know, you can't respect as such, but you can, or admire, but you can kind of.
Well, she was a brilliant pilot. She was.
Yeah, her abilities are not in question. That or neither of their abilities in question. Just the reason they were doing it, we can definitely question. That's the, and I think, you know, when, you know, people watching it, if I want to read a book about an aircraft and how it was tested, I will buy a book about the development of the Junkers 88 or something. The point is, your book is about the people who were test pilots, but they were also people living through this incredible time in history. And it's about, to me, it was about them and their motivations and what is driving them forward and how they are witnessing this chapter in history. And if I want to read about testing an aircraft, I would read about it. Although there is plenty of stuff in there about testing aircraft.
I've had some people, you say on Amazon, oh, really good, but a shame that you didn't have more on the aircraft stuff, and other people saying, well, shame it was kind of a bit technical heavy, you know. So I think you've got both, and that's the wonderful thing about their stories, that, you know, you can, because they live such dramatic lives and the work they're doing is so fascinating, you can slip in quite a lot of the, you know, what makes it work, the logic behind it as well, without it becoming heavy, you know. So
if you're getting criticism saying it's too technical and not technical enough, it's like when the BBC get criticized for being pro-Tory or pro-Labour. If they're getting both sets of criticism, it must mean they're straddling the middle somewhere. So yeah. So I think, you know, it's been amazing talking to you, Claire, and you're always welcome to come back on and talk about The Spy Who Loved at another point and talk about that side of things, because that's always interesting. But in terms of what we're doing today, I think we've gone round, and an amazing book. I hold it up again. We'll both hold up our different copies there. And yeah, so it's an incredible book. And for those who are watching, thank you very much, Claire, for joining us. In terms of what we're doing here on World War II TV, we've got our first part of our World War II comics show tomorrow night with Garth Ennis. And for those who haven't heard of Garth Ennis, he is described as the Quentin Tarantino of World War II comic writings. Incredible guy. Ferg Handley and Billy Tucci joining me tomorrow, and then lots more shows next over the couple of weeks. But in terms of what we're doing tonight, don't forget to click subscribe. Don't forget to click the little bell to get the notifications. If you would like to check out our Patreon page, that's also worth doing. The link to Claire's website is in the description below, where you can find about her public speaking and her TV appearances and her other books and what have you. and they're all brilliant. So thank you very much, Claire. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for tuning in. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you.
We've enjoyed it. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all again soon on World War II TV. Thank you. Good. It's just us then. That was great.